Welcome to the Drips Draughts Podcast, where we help you bring your craft to draft. From soda to beer and from coffee to kombucha, we'll discuss making your favorite craft beverage in small or large batches and how to best serve it on draft. Hey there, and welcome to the Drips Draughts Podcast. My name's Brendan Hansen, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us on this first episode. Actually, we're going to call this episode 0. We're just going to use this episode to give you a little introduction as to who we are and why we're doing this podcast. So let's get into it. As I mentioned before, my name's Brendan Hansen. About 10 years ago or so, probably about 2006, my brother Kerry started home brewing. And shortly after he started home brewing, he got me into home brewing. And I think it was while my first batch of beer was fermenting, we met up with a couple local brewers and they asked if we were kegging our beer. And Kerry and I kind of looked at each other like, no, we're not kegging our beer. We clean about 50 bottles every time we make a batch and, we just put it in there. These guys were like, you have to keg. You have to keg your beer. You can put it in the keg and you can drink it the next day. It's ready to go. Whereas, when you homebrew beer, if you put it in a bottle, you've got to wait a couple weeks for it to carbonate. So that piqued my interest. They actually gave me an empty keg shell and told me to hop online, pick up a carbonation kit, a CO2 tank, and everything else. That was basically my foray or my entry into the world of kegging. And the reason I'm bringing that up, I'm bringing that up for two reasons. One is that led us to start Keg Outlet and start selling kegging supplies online. And two is because a lot of the coffee shops I talk to, a lot of the owners, the roasters, the baristas have never worked with any sort of draft beer or draft beverage equipment. And, it can be a little daunting when you haven't used any of this type of equipment before, but you want to start kegging your coffee. A lot of times we get the question, is this something I can do? Is this something that I'm going to be able to do? And we're pretty much here just to tell you that the answer is yes. While the equipment can look a little daunting to a first-time user, it is pretty easy to get set up and learn how to use it. And that's what we're here for. That's kind of why we started this podcast, to introduce new industries to draft equipment. So after Kerry and I founded Keg Outlet, we quickly learned that all of our customers and all the people that we got to work with, primarily home brewers at the start and small and nano craft breweries, everybody who we worked with was very, very passionate about what they did and what they were making. And both Kerry and I shared that passion because we were home brewers. And after we got into kegging, we just started thinking, okay, what else can we keg? What else could we put in a keg? So we started making sodas. We started making sparkling waters. And then eventually we started putting cold brew coffee in a keg, and we just serve flat cold brew coffee. And once we started serving cold brew coffee on draft, we started writing some blog posts and some articles about it. And we started getting more and more questions. People wondering, okay, can I do this? What's it going to take to do this? So we just kind of, documented all of our successes and all of our failures on our blog with regards to serving coffee on draft. And that's what led us and has brought us to starting Cold Brew Avenue and starting the Cold Brew Avenue Forum, which you can go to at forum.coldbrewavenue.com. As we've gotten the chance to work with more and more coffee shops and more coffee shop owners and coffee roasters, we found that the coffee industry is very, very similar to the beer industry in the fact that all the people who are making coffee, roasting coffee, serving coffee are very, very passionate about what they're doing. Just like home brewers are very passionate about the beer that they're making. Just like craft brewers are super passionate about the beers that they're making. So we've really enjoyed working with all the members of the coffee community, learning about and growing the draft coffee trend. And that's really one of the big reasons why we've put the forum together, the Cold Brew Avenue Forum. We want a place where people can go, where coffee professionals can go and ask questions and bounce ideas off of one another, share successes, share failures, what's working well, what doesn't work at all, like CO2 in coffee. We made that mistake a couple times. I'll tell you right now, just don't do it. Stay away from carbon dioxide when you're serving coffee on draft. It's not good. I'm getting a little off topic here. Let's get back on track. back to the podcast, back to Draft Coffee, back to the Cold Brew Avenue forum. Really, the reason we ended up starting this forum was we sent a newsletter out to our few thousand subscribers who have an interest in cold brew coffee and draft coffee. And we asked, would you have interest in a podcast? And if we did a podcast, would you have any interest in being on the podcast? And so far, we've gotten an incredible response. And more than half of those people have said, yes, we'd love to be on your podcast. So from all those responses, we've also received over 300 questions on topics that people want to see covered, want to hear covered about draft coffee, about cold brewing coffee, about serving nitro coffee, about carbonating coffee, which I already alluded to is not good. So in future episodes, we've got a lot of content. We've got a lot of things we want to cover. And we also want to bring on coffee professionals, people who are doing this day in and day out. Because at the end of the day, it's the coffee professionals who are going to be doing a lot more experimenting than Carrie and I would be able to do. We've done large batches, we've done different grinds, but it's the coffee professionals who, really take this stuff to the next level. We've talked to people who hot bloom their coffee, then cold brew for 12 hours. We talk to people who dial in their water chemistry, which is something that's very common in home brewing and microbrewing, but it's not something that you always hear about when making coffee. So in addition to having guests on in the future and really diving deep into some topics regarding coffee and cold brewing coffee, let me just run through some of the questions that we've received so that you can know what to expect in future episodes. How can I get the nitro coffee into a can? How do you set up a nitro tap? What's the best ratio for cold brewing? What's the best way to brew for a nitro tap, and what's the best way to brew for a regular tap? What's the best type of gas to use? How long does the creamy head last on a cup of nitro coffee? Can you make it at home? How is it different from draft beer? How can I set up a mobile serving station? What's the simplest and most low-cost setup that I can start with? So these are all great questions, and we've got so many more to go through in future episodes. So if you've got any interest in either being on our podcast or submitting a question, we suggest you do so. Send us an email at questions@coldbrewavenue.com or tweet us at coldbrewavenue on Twitter or on Instagram. If you haven't done so already, check out our private forum. It's at forum.coldbrewavenue.com.